I guess I'd like to do the formalities of acknowledging that we're on Darug land today. I pay my respects to elders past, present. If there's anyone present today with First Nations heritage, I acknowledge that and respect that. And I think today as we talk about connection, care and organising, I think it's important to recognise that these are principles that have been practised on this land for tens of thousands of years. So today I'll be talking about wall work and who carries the load and why connection is actually a class issue. So in so-called Australia, we're lucky enough that when we talk about war, we imagine it as something distant. So war is fought overseas and it's something we don't really need to think about. That's definitely less so at the moment. I think in the first couple of weeks of the year already, we've seen the geopolitical landscape shift so rapidly. Kidnapping the Venezuelan president, new and more intense strikes in Syria, South Lebanon, ICE agents murdering civilians in the US, and tensions just continue to rise in Iran. So despite all of that happening internationally, there are huge ramifications for us domestically. Military spending is prioritised while public services are restrained. And when budgets tighten, education obviously absorbs the cost through staffing, larger classes, extra workload. And that's not a coincidence. I think we need to start looking at how the state funds war without taxing wealth. And I guess the crux of it is bombs get funded really quickly. There's always money for bombs and classrooms are told to wait, and we're seeing that with the funding that's been promised to us and how slowly that's going to be rolled out. So now more than ever, it's important to remember that war isn't an exception to the system. It's one of the ways in which the system actually stabilises itself. War reorganises labour and war redistributes resources. War produces winners and losers, and very predictably along class lines. What often goes unspoken is the fact that war doesn't only destroy, it transfers its costs. Those costs don't disappear, they have to land somewhere, and more often than not, they land in public systems. They land in classrooms, they land in homes, they land on workers, and increasingly they land on workers like ourselves whose labour is already undervalued, already stretched, and already assumed to be limitless. That's where public education workers in particular come in. So education is what we sometimes refer to as a quiet front of war. Public education doesn't exist outside the global politics that we're seeing. It absorbs everything that's happening. When governments pull billions into militarisation, which we're seeing, they tell us there's no money for smaller classes, no money for specialist support, no money for wellbeing staff, no permanent jobs. So what happens instead? The system relies on us to absorb the shortfall. We are expected to manage trauma without training, to build relationships without adequate time, and meet needs without resources. You do it because you care. How many times have you been told that? You do it for the kids. So it's all framed as care. Teachers can cope because they're flexible and resilient. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that's not accidental. That's how this concept of austerity works. So those of you who are familiar with that concept, in schools, austerity looks like larger class sizes, fewer counsellors. I'm sure you've seen those cutbacks in schools, or they work part-time now, or they share. Fewer learning support staff, increasing casualisation, short-term contracts, and of course our unpaid overtime has become really normalised. We're just expected to do the extra stuff. And wellbeing rhetoric is replacing actual material support. It's, we'll have a nice morning tea and we'll do this for our staff but there's actually no material support for staff in the classrooms. Instead of funding solutions, systems are relying on our goodwill, our resilience, and our so-called passion for teaching. That's expected to just get us through. Which brings us to that concept of social reproduction. And those of us who listened to Jack's amazing talk will remember that hidden engine of capitalism that he spoke about. So we know that labour produces value, but who reproduces the workforce itself? Who educates the children? Who manages the emotional fallout? Who holds communities together when systems fail? That is that concept of social reproduction, and we saw it really clearly during COVID when under capitalism, labour's unpaid or underpaid, taken for granted, and, for the women in the room, heavily gendered, right? Education sits right at the centre of this. As educators, we don't just deliver curriculum, we reproduce the conditions that allow society to function. And when society is destabilised by war, imperialism or economic crisis, all of which we're seeing at the moment, that reproductive labour intensifies. So I suppose this leads us to consider who absorbs this systemic change when crisis hits. Historically and materially, the answer is women, not because of identity, but because of position in the labour system. In education, the workforce is predominantly female. Emotional labour is just expected, not recognised. And flexibility is demanded, not rewarded. When services are cut, women are just expected to fill the gaps. When workloads increase, women are praised for coping so well. When burnout occurs, I think this really resonates, it's individualised. It's because it's a personal failure. It's not politicised. This isn't a cultural problem. It's actually a class strategy. So it's important to recognise that imperial wars don't just destroy infrastructure, they destroy social fabric. And at the heart of this, it brings us to my underlying theme of connections. That's why schools, teachers and women are often targeted. They are anchors of continuity. We sustain memory, community. We pass on that idea of collective identity. At a local level, we have seen how underfunding education fragments staff cohesion. It ruins student relationships. And increasingly, those of us, who have been involved in Federation, we're seeing it fragment union participation and membership rates. A disconnected workforce is easier to manage. So isolation is not a side effect, it is functional for capital. When people are exhausted and isolated, organising becomes harder. Again, that's not accidental, it is functional because a disconnected workforce, as I said, is easier to discipline, easier to exhaust. Here's where connection becomes central. Capitalism, especially under austerity, depends on isolation. Union organising depends on connection, particularly connections with fellow public education workers in networks like PWA. Capital thrives when workers are isolated, exhausted and individually responsible for systemic failures. Connection interrupts all of that. Building relationships does three things. It makes exploitation visible. It turns our private stress that we're all feeling into collective understanding, and it creates the conditions, hopefully, for organised resistance. The same relational skills we use to keep schools functioning under austerity are the skills that can make PWA really powerful when they're politicised. So things like listening, trust building, checking in, holding space for each other, they're often dismissed as soft skills. But historically, they've been core organising skills. Every strong labour movement has been rooted in shared spaces, political education, collective care. This is why feminised labour is so dangerous to capital when politicised, because it already understands relational power. So that's where I think PWA becomes strategically important. Infrastructure isn't just buildings, it's the systems that organise our daily working lives. So when I sat to think about infrastructure, I thought of the NESA, Department of Education Management hierarchies, the compliance and accreditation processes, the different channels in human resources, individual grievance pathways and the hoops they make us jump through. So those structures all organise us vertically as opposed to horizontally, right? So they're designed in that way intentionally. And that's why I think PWA isn't just an organising structure, it's a counter infrastructure. In a system designed to fragment us, building connection is an act of resistance. Love that resistance word. When we talk across roles, we share experiences, we listen rather than compete, which I think in teaching is really lacking. In my whole 20 plus years of teaching, I've always felt that sense of competition unnecessarily. We're all in the same boat together and we should be fighting together. When we talk across roles and we do that, we're actually politicising what we're sort of told is just part of the job. We're rebuilding that class consciousness. So historically, unions themselves were counter-infrastructure, which, things like workers' halls, reading groups, which hopefully we can get going maybe, strike committees, mutual aid networks. PWA sits squarely in that tradition, I feel. It creates horizontal connection across roles. It politicizes experiences that are individualized elsewhere. So we had earlier on Jamie speak about being put on an improvement program and what that looks like. And that was very much seen as his personal issue and individualized from his management. But when he brought it to us, it was politicized, and we could all sort of take it on board as something that as a system needs to be addressed. And I think that's what we need to start doing, is stop seeing things as really individual in little pockets and bring it together. And that's where the power is, in collective consciousness. And obviously PWA can help us hopefully develop organising capacity. So when we have our meetings and our little social events like today, what just looks like support or conversation, and I think this is important because people from the outside might come in and say, but we're just having chats. It's actually base building, and it's consciousness raising, and it's power building. And I think that's super, super essential. Austerity doesn't just cut budgets, it's actually targeting our unions indirectly. So as I mentioned, it's overloading us so that we don't have time to organise. It fragments staff through casualisation, as I already mentioned, and it reframes solidarity as being selfish or irresponsible. Our organising interrupts this by naming structural causes, collectivising the harm, as I mentioned, and turning care into collective demand. So resistance isn't only strikes. So I think everyone immediately goes to, let's all walk out. It can be a lot slower and harder work. And I know Dave and I have had those conversations where other groups that we're aware of like to just bite the bullet and say we need to all walk out and we need to do this. But it's a lot slower work and exhausting work, but it's things like the political education. It's the collective refusal of unpaid labour. So it's the pushback. Andrew and I have spoken about potentially this year challenging some things that I'm seeing at my school. We have illustrations of practice that are due in a Google Classroom. So staff belong as students to a Google Classroom and they have to submit illustrations of their practice every month. Scan student work, show how they embedded the latest literacy strategy that's come from the Dell. So again, that's that idea that that's unpaid extra work that we're being asked to do. And often when I challenge it and I ask other teachers, did you do that? Was it out of your extra time? Was it just something? No, I took the weekend, 2 hours of a weekend to scan it all through. And why are we being asked to do that? And unless we refuse it on a collective basis, it's just going to keep being added to important. And they exist because we need to accept that individual resistance has limits. So when we resist on our own, there's going to be pushback, okay? But collective resistance doesn't. I think that's what we need to keep pushing. Everything I've spoken about today stems from something which has a name, but I've been reluctant to use it. Socialist feminism. Not as an identity, but as an analysis. This certainly isn't about men versus women, and I hated the idea of, but as a female speaker, I thought it was important to touch on these issues. It's about recognising how exploiting gender weakens all of us and how solidarity strengthens us. We must insist that war, which I spoke about initially, is a class project. Austerity shifts costs to us, and education is political. Care is labour. So care and connection that we've spoken about is labour. And the connection that we form is the power. So if capital depends on isolating us, then our task is clear. We have to organise, we have to connect. We refuse to carry the cost alone because when gendered labour is invisible, capital wins. But when workers build connection, we win. And if war relies on fragmentation, then building connection is not secondary to resistance, it's the foundation of it. And I think the thing that makes PWA different is that this isn't about ideology for its own sake. We don't come and just discuss things and walk away. It's about understanding the material conditions that are shaping our work, because if we don't really understand the mechanisms that are creating this added work, we can't change them. So I'm hoping that together we can do that. And in teacher form, I'm going to give you a little handout and an activity. So I just wanted us all to think about maybe how we can move from isolation to connection. So just who is well connected in your school and who is most isolated. So just thinking strategically, when I look at my school, people that are isolated are the people that are in their little offices. The librarian, our head teacher, teaching and learning, has a little office off the library. We've got a support teacher who lives on her own. So there are some real pockets of isolation in the school. So maybe just thinking about who is isolated as opposed to who are more connected. What helps move people from the isolation to the connection? So there's the formal stuff where you have meetings and whatnot, but there's also the discussions on playground duty. Do you invite people to after-hours drinks where connections occur? And then what allows that to then transfer to collective action? So how do we transfer those conversations and that connection to actually getting them to sort of build action? So just some thoughts, and I guess you can work with your partner, the person next to you. I have some pens. Because I really want to see us move from like our discussion space to capacity building. So how can we like practically apply
Hand them out, miss.
stuff with?
No handing out, miss. Did I hand them out?
Take one and pass them on, and you'll get a gold star at the end.